This isn't reflected in my audience numbers, but I can see how this is probably true nonetheless. In a new survey, 31% of U.S. weekly podcast listeners said YouTube is their most used platform to listen to podcasts, surpassing Spotify at 27% and Apple Podcasts at 15%. Quoting the Journal, because these days, we don't just listen to podcasts. Now we watch podcasts. It's a profound shift that suddenly has the world's audio giants battling for supremacy in the increasingly valuable world of video podcasts. It's becoming all about video, Daniel Ek, Spotify's chief executive, told my colleague Anne Steele this week. The most improbable thing about how YouTube made the podcast market all about video is how swiftly it happened. Only 4 years ago, when it was less popular for podcasts than both Spotify and Apple, YouTube becoming a podcasting colossus sounded about as realistic as Martin Scorsese releasing his next movie on TikTok. With billions of users around the world, YouTube has the kind of scale that other platforms can only dream about. In fact, it recently passed Netflix as the streamer with the most TV viewership in America, according to Nielsen data. And the company says 150 million people in the U.S. now watch YouTube on their TVs every month, which means it has conquered the living rooms of nearly half the country. As it happens, 5 years ago is when YouTube began to detect that video podcasts were catching on. They really took off during the pandemic when podcasters started recording their Zoom conversations, and there was so much demand for human interaction that listeners actually watched them. Once it had several years of data about the stickiness of video podcasts, the company owned by Google decided to pour resources into this peculiar new format. We saw this trend organically emerging, said Tim Katz, YouTube's vice president of partnerships, and then we wanted to invest in it. For users, that meant making podcasts more prominent and much easier to discover on the platform. For creators, that meant rolling out podcast-specific tools and showing how they could make real money, turning their audio podcasts into videos, since YouTube pays them a share of the advertising revenue from their content, end quote.